Hello, this is Morel Bernard with the continuing story of an American, Booker T. Washington. And, by the way, please subscribe, please share the video. Last words with Booker T. Washington was that, but it would also have been available for the farmer and his family during the whole or the greater part of the year. The conditions which I have described had a discouraging effect upon many people who tried to get their living from the soil. As numbers of them expressed it to me, if they worked hard during the year, they came out at the end in debt. And if they did not work, they found themselves in debt anyhow. Some went so far as to perform only sufficient work to make a show of raising enough cotton or which to get advances during the year, with no thought of ridding themselves of debt or of coming out ahead. Notwithstanding these conditions, there were instances each year of individuals who triumphed over all these difficulties and discouragements and came out with considerable money or cotton to their credit. These men soon got to the point where they could begin to buy their own homes. In justice to the class of men in the South who advance money or provisions each year to the farmers, I ought to say that many of them deplore the state of affairs to which I have referred as much as anyone. But with them, it is simply a system of lending money on uncertain security. If these advances were not made, in many instances the farmers and their families would starve. The average merchant prefers to deal with a man who owns his land and can pay cash for his goods. But the many ramifications of the mortgage system make both the farmer and the money lender slaves to the one crop plan. If cotton fails, or if the tenant abandons the crop before it is matured, the money lender is bound to lose. Both with the farmer and the money lender, it has been like the old story of the man hugging the bear, each desperately anxious to find a way to get free. From the first, I was painfully conscious of the fact that I could do very little through the work of the Tuskgee Institute to help the situation. But I was determined to make an effort to do what I could. Many of my own race had been reduced to discouragement and despair. Before the school could begin its practical help, I spent all the time that could be spared in going about among the people, holding meetings and talking with individual leaders to arouse their ambition and inspire in them hope and confidence. My first effort was to try to help the masses through the medium of the thing that was nearest to them, and in which they had the most vital and practical interest. I knew that if we could teach a man's son to raise 40 bushels of corn on an acre of ground, which had before produced but 20 bushels, and if he could be taught to raise this corn with less labor than before, we should gain the confidence and sympathy of that boy's father at once. In this connection, I've often thought that missionaries in foreign countries would make greater progress if at first more emphasis were placed upon the industrial and material side than upon the purely spiritual side of education. Almost any heathen family would, I believe, appreciate at once the difference between a shack and a comfortable house, while it might require years to make them appreciate the truths of the Bible. Through the medium of the home, the heart could be reached. Long ago, I was asked by a missionary who was going into a foreign field what, in my opinion, he ought to teach the people. and how he ought to begin. I asked him what the principal occupation of the people was among whom he was going, and he replied that it was the raising of sheep. I advised him then to begin his missionary work by teaching the people how to raise more sheep than they were raising, and better sheep, and said that I thought the people would soon decide that a man who could excel them in the raising of sheep might also excel them in the matter of religion, and that thus this foundation for effectual mission work might be laid. The first students of our school came largely from the farming districts. The earliest need at the Tuskgee school was food for teachers and students. I said, let us raise this food, and while doing so, teach the students the latest and best methods of farming. At the same time, we could teach them the dignity and advantages of farm life and of work with their hands. It was easy to see the reasons for doing this and easy to resolve to do it, but I soon found that there were several stubborn and serious difficulties to be overcome. The first and perhaps the hardest of these was to conquer the idea, by no means confined to my race, that a school was a place where one was expected to do nothing but study books, where one was expected not to study things, but to study about things. Least of all did the students feel that a school was a place where one would be taught actually to do things. Aside from this, the students had a very general idea that working with the hands was in a large measure disgraceful, and that they wanted to get an education because education was something which was meant to enable people to live without handwork. In addition to the objections named, I found that when I began to speak very gently and even cautiously to the students about the plan of teaching them to work on the farm, two other objections manifested themselves with more or less emphasis. One was that most of the students wanted to get out of the country into a town or a city, and the other, that many of them said they were anxious to prepare themselves for some kind of professional life, and that they therefore did not need the farm work. The most serious obstacle, however, was the argument that since they and their parents for generations back had tilled the soil, they knew all there was to be known about farming and did not need to be taught any more about it while in school. These objections on the part of the students were reinforced by the parents of many of them. Not a few of the fathers and mothers urged that because the race had been worked for 250 years or more, now it ought to have a chance to rest. With all of my earnestness and argument, I was unable in the earlier years of the school to convert all the parents and students to my way of thinking. And for this reason, many of the students went home of their own accord or were taken home by their parents. None of these things, however, turned the school aside from doing the things which we were convinced the people most needed to have done for them. I shall always remember the day when we decided actually to begin the teaching of farming, not out of books, but by real and tangible work. In the morning, I explained to the young men our need of food to eat, and the desire of the food to teach them to work with their hands. I told them that we would begin with the farm, because that was the most important need. The young men were greatly surprised when the hour came to begin work to find me present with my coat off, ready to begin digging up stumps and clearing the land. As my first request was more in the form of an invitation than a command, I found that only a few reported for work. I soon learned, too, that these few were ashamed to have anyone see them at work. After we had put in several hours of vigorous toil, I noticed that their interest began to grow because they came to realize that it was not my farm they were helping to cultivate, but that it belonged to the school, in which we all had a common interest. The next afternoon, a larger number reported for duty. They were still shy about having anyone see them at work, however, and were especially timorous at the idea of being caught in the field by the girl students. Gradually, year by year, the difficulties which I have enumerated began to melt away, but not without constant effort and very tiring embarrassments. It soon became evident that the students had practical knowledge of only one industry, and that was the cultivation of cotton in the manner in which it had been grown by their fathers for years. Another defect soon became evident, and that was that they had little idea of caring for tools or livestock. Ploughs, hoes, and other farming implements were left in the field where they were last used. If quitting time came when the hoe was being used in the middle of a field or at the end of a row, the tool remained there overnight. Where the last ploughing in the fall was done, there the plough would most likely spend the winter. No better care than this was given to wagons or harness, and mules and horses shared this impartial neglect. It was a custom in the earlier days of the school, as it is now, for students and teachers to assemble in the evening for prayers. After considerable ineffective effort to teach the students to put their implements away properly at night, I caused a mild sensation at evening prayers by calling the names of 3 students who had left their implements in the field. I said that these 3 students would be excused from the room to attend to this duty, and that we would not proceed with the service until their return, and that I felt sure they would be more benefited by prayer and song after having done their work well than by leaving it poorly done. A few lessons of this kind began to work a notable betterment in the care with which the students looked after their implements and attended to other details of their daily round. I cannot emphasize too often the fact that my experience in building up the Tuskgee Institute has taught me year by year the value of handwork in the building of character. I frequently found one concrete, definite example illustrating the difference between right and wrong worth more than hours of abstract lecturing on morality. I've told girls many times that a dish is either thoroughly washed and dried, or it is not. If a thing is not well done, it is poorly done. Furthermore, I have taught our girls from the beginning of this school that a student who receives pay for properly attending to dishes and does her work poorly is guilty of 2 wrongs. Well, she's guilty of falsehood and guilty of receiving money for doing something which she has not done. The lessons taught in the kitchen with the carelessly cleaned utensils in evidence as an illustration has a power that is hard to resist. Just so, the implement left in the field overnight has many times been made to teach the same lessons of warning against untruth and dishonesty. Leaving it there was untruthful because the student had said by his action that he had properly performed the work of the day. It was dishonest because the school had been robbed of a portion of the value of the implement by reason of the rain and dew falling on it, and causing it to rust and depreciate in value. In the beginning, our methods of instruction in farming were primitive and crude, but month by month and year by year, steady growth encouraged our efforts. One difficulty to which I have not referred was that the land on which we began work was not the richest in the world. When attention was called by the students and others to the poor quality of the soil, I replied that poor soil was the best in which to begin the teaching of agriculture, because this would give us an opportunity to learn to make poor land rich. I told them also that if we could teach the students how to cultivate poor land profitably, they would have little difficulty in making more than a living upon fairly good or rich soil. Apart from the problems found on the school grounds, our methods were at first misunderstood by schools officials in high authority throughout the country, and our aims were not appreciated by other schools established in the South for education of my race. I remember that after I had spoken for an hour at a meeting of State Teachers Association, trying to explain the meaning and advantages of industrial education or handwork, a teacher arose and asked the state superintendent who was present a very simple question regarding the subject. The superintendent replied that he would have to refer the question to me, as the subject was one that he had never heard discussed before. It happened occasionally that students on their way to the Tuskgee Institute were asked if they were going to an ox driving school. The question implying, I suppose, that the main thing taught at Tuskegee was ox driving. Our critics, however, did not know that at the time we were too poor to own oxen, and that on our little farm we had nothing in the way of draft animals except for one poor blind horse, which a white friend in Tuskegee had given us. During the first year, the training in agriculture on the school farm consisted of about 2 hours of work daily for each of the young men students, the remaining time being spent in the classrooms. The outdoor period during the first school session was mostly spent in grubbing up stumps, felling trees, building fences, making ditches, and in ploughing the ground preparatory to planting a little crop. We had few implements with which to do this work, and most of these were borrowed. The reader will realize how hard it must have been under these conditions to make the student feel that he was acquiring new knowledge of farm life. As I recall it now, I'm sure that the main thing that we were able to teach the students in those early days was that book education did not mean a divorce from work with the hands. Gradually, we were able to secure more land for farming purposes and to cultivate what we did have to better advantage. As the school grew, we learned more about the proper fertilization of the soil and how to use labor-saving machinery more effectively. It was surprising to note how many of the students believed that farm labor must, from its very nature, be hard, and that it was not quite the proper thing to use too much labor-saving machinery. Indeed, many of the white planters in certain sections of the South have until recently refused to encourage the use of much agricultural machinery for the reason, as they stated it, that such assistance would spoil the Negro farm hands. For some years, the Tuskgee Institute did not escape this charge. As our Department of Farming grew from month to month, I was not afraid to let it be known that I felt certain that one result of any proper system of hand training was to spoil or get rid of the ordinary farm hand. If one will study the industrial development of the South, he will be forced to the conclusion that one of the factors that has most retarded its progress has been and is the farm hand. This individual has too long controlled the agriculture of the South. With few exceptions, he is ignorant and unskilled, with little conscience. He seldom owns the land which he pretends or tries to cultivate. Too often he is a person who has no permanent abiding place, and if he has one, it is probably a miserable one-room cabin. The farm hand can be hired for from 40 to 60 cents a day. In fact, I have known of cases where such men were hired for 25 cents a day and their board, and they were very dear help, even at that price. The real life story of Booker T. Washington. Please join me for the next video of the life of Booker T. Washington. Okay, and please subscribe, please share. Booker T. Washington, next video. See you then. Bye.